My name is Brinkley Messick. I'm a professor of anthropology and in the faculty collective of the Center for Palestine Studies. I'd like to welcome you to the second session of this conference. And does this section actually have a separate title? I thought maybe it did at some point. Maybe I can retrieve that separate title. Counter Memory and Resistance. Yes. So that's good. Okay. And I'd like to introduce the two speakers, Mohammed Junaid and Richard Shapiro. But first, I'll do them one at a time before they speak, rather than a collective introduction. Mohammed Junaid is a doctoral candidate in cultural anthropology at the Graduate Center, City University of New York. His writings focus on military occupation, space, memory, martyrdom, and violence in Kashmir. He's contributed to edited volumes, a list of them, and he's also has essays that have appeared in Economic and Political Weekly, Greater Kashmir, Kashmir Reader, Al Jazeera, etc. His dissertation is an ethnographic study of the practices of protest and the formation of political subjectivity in Kashmir. He is a founder of Kashmir Solidarity Network, which seeks to build a critical understanding of the Kashmir question, as well as solidarity with scholars and activists in Kashmir. So we'll begin with Mohammed Junaid.
Thank you, Professor Brinkley Messick. I'm thrilled that we're talking about Kashmir under the auspices of the Center for Palestine Studies. So thank you, Angana, and also thank you, Abdul Rahim, for inviting me to this symposium. Over the last few years, I and my other Kashmiri colleagues have been regularly invited to participate in events where the Palestinian, the Kurdish, the Tamil question, and the Tamil question is also discussed. It's not a coincidence, but really part of an emergent sense among those who work or live in these places that there are uncanny resemblances in the way the logics of domination work and in the languages that the resistance movements there produce. While we have been making these cross-regional connections in the symposium today, especially through Abdul Rahim's invocation of democracy of death, my presentation is also about uncanny resemblances across time. I look at how the past emerges in the present of those who seek to comprehend their situation in the aftermath of what was hailed as the end of colonialism. Or in other words, to understand how the biography of the post-colonial nation state appears to those who live in its current neocolonized margins. Post-colonial condition has mostly been examined by scholars from global metropoles or from within post-colonial national centers. The spatial and political location of this critical scholarship is structured by the disjunctive as well as the dialogic arc posited between the former colonizers and the formerly colonized subjects. This location produces invaluable insights into the unacknowledged forms of experience and knowledge within the post-colony and reinscribes the constitutive heterogeneity of the post-colonial publics. But it also tends to replicate internally the invisibilities and silences often associated with the colonial modalities of knowledge production. How do we understand the contention of those who say that they sense a colonial deja vu when trying to comprehend their current situation? My paper explores this question through the work of contemporary Tehreek history writers in Kashmir, who question the foundational claims of the Indian nation states or Indian states' control over Kashmir, and whose writings have emerged in contestation with the official nationalist accounts. Crucially, the Tehreek history writers, their narratives are shaped by their experience of living under a regime of punitive violence and military occupation. I ask, what perspectives are produced through writings that emerge from within such spaces? I use the term history writers instead of historians, simply because they're not professional historians. History writers are neither based in academic institutions, nor do they claim authority based on a training in historical methods. Like professional historians, though, they devote considerable intellectual effort and passion to their work. As history writers, they are autodidacts, often, as they themselves say, thrown into writing or forced to write to present the true picture. They are generally sympathetic to the Tehreek movement in that they accept its key assumptions about the Kashmiri right to self-determination, and broadly the contention that the year 1947 does not represent a transition to freedom, which is how the nationalist historiography in India sees the event. Their writings circulate widely within the activist circles in Kashmir, if not always within the broader Kashmiri public sphere. There's a reason. In public schools, for instance, only authorized Indian accounts are allowed. History writers, their books are sometimes self-published or are serially produced within local news publications or newspapers. They largely write in a conversational style, mostly in English and Urdu, but rarely in Kashmiri. Again, the reason is that since early 1950s, Kashmiris were institutionally denied learning in their native language, which created a society that could speak its tongue but hardly read or write in it. My own interest in Tehreek history writers emerged from reading silences about Kashmir within the Indian historiography, including in the canonical works of the Subaltern Studies Collective, which had otherwise critiqued the nationalist historiography on other counts. Whenever Kashmir was mentioned, it was subsumed under the overarching master sign India. This included not only writing the Kashmiri past under the framework of Indian history, but also subsuming the Indian experience before and after 1947 as shared more or less uniformly across the territorial expanse, which eventually became the Indian state. While the Euro-centered history was critiqued and questioned and appropriately sought to be provincialized, its logic was simultaneously replicated within the writings of Indian history. Despite calls to denaturalize the Indian nation space as the inappropriate and a historical realm for writing subcontinental histories, the question has remained largely deferred. Some of the early Tehreek history writings in Kashmir emerged in the period immediately after 1947, and I might, towards the end, point towards that a little bit. But Tehreek history writers mostly or primarily wrote in the aftermath of the popular protest and armed movement for independence that began in 1989-90. This post-1990 period is marked by an intensively spatialized logic of military occupation, which under the legalized regime of non-liable violence turned Kashmir into a space of death. The history writers did not form a school or group and are largely independent of each other. Some are local literary figures, journalists, lawyers, or even retired government employees. But most others have been full-time Tehreek activists. They regularly encounter each other, but only in very few cases have I noted any sustained mutual engagement with each other's texts. This lack of cohesiveness, I was told, has had partly to do with adopting a guerrilla tactics in writing, amid a system which appears determined to deprive all intellectual support to the movement. My own anthropological attempt in relation to the Tehreek history writers is to trace a genealogy of Kashmir's political present by, to borrow a phrase from Clifford Geertz, looking over the shoulders of those already doing so. I try to understand why do the history writers read the dilemmas of the present as traumatic remnants from the past? What events are accorded importance in their writings? How do their accounts diverge from the official history? And in general, what new light do their narratives shed on the practices of post-colonial historiography in the Indian subcontinent? Kashmiri historical consciousness has not emerged out of a need to have a history. Instead, it emerged in contestation with a prescribed one, the official story authorized by the occupier state. Indian accounts adopted the colonial Brahmin modality of seeing Kashmir as part of a sacred Hindu geography. The latter emphasized the notion of Hindu antiquity buried under a Muslim surface. While as I will mention further down this part, much of the effort for the Tehreek history writers has gone into an engagement with the contemporary political struggle. Accordingly, 3 periods of modern Kashmiri history have become major areas of contestation. First, the nature of the pre-1947 mass movement. Second, the 1947 events and the Kashmiri response to it. And third, the post-1990 era of occupation and fragmentation. As the focus on 1947 events suggests, legitimating their arguments for independence based on history, Tehreek history writers find themselves in a double bind. They distinguish Kashmir's pre-1947 past from the experiences of colonialism in South Asia. And yet that past remains entangled with the processes that were unfolding elsewhere in the subcontinent. For instance, the British East India Company's annexation policies and setting up of princely states precipitated the sale of Kashmir to the Dogras via the Treaty of Amritsar in 1846. This led to the establishment of a Hindu absolutist state over a largely Muslim subject population, which lasted till 1947. Next, there is the way the anti-colonial Indian elite, principally Nehru, came to nurture their territorialist imagination. That imagination formed the ideological background to the subsequent invasions of those regions in post-47 period that hesitated in accepting Indian authority or wanted to chart their own political future. These subcontinent-wide processes were ultimately capped by partition, which triggered the division of Kashmir between India and Pakistan and a massive displacement of Kashmiris from their homeland. The double bind for Tehreek history writers has been therefore to show that while they shared with the pre-47 anti-colonial struggle in the subcontinent a common distaste for foreign rule, for Kashmiris, it is the Indian control that represents imperialism, the way the British had represented for Indians. At the same time, they feel compelled to show that the pre-47 mass movement in Kashmir, which had started in 1931, was centered not on an anti-colonial premise, since there was no colonialism in Kashmir per se, but on an anti-monarchical one. The principal argument of difference with the dominant post-colonial history then is that Kashmir was not part of the British Indian Empire, neither politically nor in any national affective sense. Kashmir had earlier passed through longer periods of independence and shorter ones of outside rule, and since 1846 had largely been an independent sovereign state under the Dogra monarchy. Throughout, Kashmiris had retained a sense of belonging, which didn't see itself as Indian, and despite the fact that most were Muslims, neither did they see themselves as Pakistani. The pre-47 Kashmiri movement was centered on establishing what was called a responsible government, and equal and full citizenship rights for Muslims and Hindus, and even a socialist democratic republic within an independent state. These were goals which had appeared close to hand in 1947, when the reign of the faltering Dogra monarch, facing rebellions from his majority Muslim subjects, was nearing an end. But as he fled his capital in Srinagar, the monarch signed the accession treaty with India, inviting Indian military into the state to suppress the rebels, some of whom had been joined by Pashtuns from the northwestern frontier province, which had become part of Pakistan. The Pashtuns themselves had arrived in reaction to a large-scale ethnic cleansing of Muslims in the southern Jammu region, which was the monarchy's traditional stronghold. The ethnic cleansing was carried out by Dogra troops as well as by right-wing Indian militias entering the state from the south. For Tehreek history writers, Jammu Massacre, as it has come to be called, is a critical event, the foundational act of violence coterminous with the establishment of Indian rule. Nakba, call it. Yet, this violence remains completely ignored in the official accounts. New scholarship on the event outside of the Tehreek history writing reveals that between 200,000 to 250,000 might have been killed, while 500,000 forced to migrate to Pakistan or settle in the western regions of Kashmir, which came to be under Pakistan, now called Azad Kashmir. What Tehreek history writers point out is that at the time, a diverse array of political groups and activists, including Muslim constitutional monarchists, communists, pro-Pakistan socialists, peasants and workers' conference activists, and radical independentists were exiled or excluded, and their projects hidden from view. Only the National Conference under Sheikh Abdullah was given prominence by Indian leaders and projected as the true voice of Kashmiris. Later official accounts represent National Conference, whose initial popularity was centered on its anti-monarchical, pro-independence stance, as having always been pro-Indian. This despite the fact that the bonhomie between the Indian national leaders and the National Conference quickly teetered. In 1953, Nehru arrested Abdullah, exiled him from the state for the next 22 years, and set up a system of selecting, through rigged elections, loyalists to run affairs in Kashmir. While tracing an alternative history of the 1947 events is at the center of Tehreek history writers' intervention, their efforts throw into sharp relief the ideological contours of the official historiography. Here I want to lay out briefly the two paradigmatic modes of historical writing on Kashmir, to which the Tehreek history writing responds. First, in the years immediately after 1947, history writing on Kashmir was singularly focused on issues central to the Indian state's self-identity at the time, key to which was the notion of secularism and the related idea of syncretism. Much effort was devoted among professional historians to posit a gentle Kashmiri Islam as different from the extremist Pakistan or Arab Islam. The gentleness of Kashmiri Islam was seen as a result of its unproblematic cohabitation with Hinduism. In many accounts, for instance, Kashmir is seen as an essentially Hindu space in which Islam had gradually lost its orthodoxy. Consequently, as the Kashmiri identity was infused with this religious syncretistic content, which was seen to have found its natural home within the Indian state, this historical paradigm simultaneously denied this identity of its political content. It suited the Indian ideological interests well, for Kashmir could not only be territorially claimed in the name of syncretism, but Kashmir's presence in India itself became a marker of secular Indian difference with a communalist Pakistan. If you know, the later being based on the theory of Hindus and Muslims forming two separate nations. Sadly, the term Kashmiriyat, otherwise a polysemous concept in Kashmir, was made the vehicle for this project. Suffice it to say, the post-1947 religious syncretistic emphasis did not sit well with the pre-47 social history in Kashmir, where religious difference had become coterminous with class difference, which Mridu Rai in her work calls Hindu rulers Muslim subjects. Kashmiriyat invokes that class difference very well. Kashmiriyat, which also masqueraded as Kashmir's national idea, was partly therefore a projection of the logic of partition and partly the Indian nationalist territorial desire imposed on Kashmir's past. The second and the more paradigmatic or dominant paradigm of history writing, however, remained the Indian nationalist historiography itself, which presented a teleological account of the nation from what is described as the glorious age of Hinduism in ancient India to the medieval period of so-called Muslim interruptions, and then in the modern phase from anti-colonial struggle to the post-colonial nation building. This follows largely the form set in Nehru's book, The Discovery of India. Within this paradigm, Kashmir's anti-monarchical struggles, as well as efforts to create a republican state which could emancipate its Muslim subjects from the yoke of feudalism, was either erased or simply coded as a provincial element in the larger anti-colonial movement. Given these paradigms, there are broadly two oppositional logics to Tehreek history writing. The first oppositional logic seeks to excavate alternative sources of Kashmiri past and contests the early 20th century paradigm-setting colonial Brahmin emphasis on locating Kashmir within a pure Hindu Sanskrit geography. The latter saw Muslim Kashmir literally sitting atop a much grander Hindu past, which needed to be recovered through philology and archaeology. Its main proponent was Aurel Steen, a British official deputed to Kashmir, who collaborated with Brahmins in the Darbar of the Dogra monarch. The monarchy itself, in search for ideological legitimacy as Hindu rulers of a predominantly Muslim population, patronized these efforts. In recent years, this paradigm has been used by Indian nationalists to claim Aryan indigeneity in Kashmir, alongside the fact that Kashmir itself is part of the Hindu sacred geography. Kashmiri history writing, in contrast, exemplified by the work of Akhtar Mahyuddin, a popular short story writer, traces a different trajectory, which suggests mass conversions from the Brahminical caste hierarchy as a driving force behind Kashmir's transition from pre-Vedic cultures to Buddhism and later to Islam. This aligns well with many Dalit intellectual attempts in the subcontinent to trace a pre-Aryan genealogy for those communities who have lived under the regime of caste. In a playful retelling of the colonial Brahmin origin story, Mohiuddin's book, A Fresh Approach to the History of Kashmir, connects Kashmir's past with the pre-Aryan Indus Valley civilization through archaeological finds at some Neolithic sites like Bujrzahom and elsewhere, and with Dravidian languages, especially with Tamil, through common-sounding words. I call Mohiuddin's effort playful because he deploys the same methods to trace a pre-Aryan past that Steen had used to discover an Aryan Sanskritic one. Except this time, Mohiuddin goes even deeper than the age of the Vedas. And in the process, he exposes the flimsiness of philological and archaeological search for any authentic past. Yet, despite Mohiuddin's intentional playfulness, I believe he tells a more compelling story than the one Aurel Steen and his Brahmin collaborators do. The second organizing logic of Tehreek history writing is centered on events and figures of importance to the Tehreek itself. These are events that remain hidden in the shadow of 1947, and those figures who don't fall neatly into the pro-India or pro-Pakistan camps. This writing is exemplified by the work of an activist journalist named Zahiruddin. Angna mentioned him earlier in a different context. He's a multifarious personality. Zahiruddin's primary concern is to tell an alternative account of 1947, based on microhistories that agitate against the dominant narratives, and in a way subvert the event itself. His archives are the voices of old activists from various Kashmiri political formations that participated in the anti-monarchical movement and differed with Sheikh Abdullah's endorsement of the accession treaty. As Zahiruddin says, quote, "History does not forgive anyone. We have to put people in the witness box," unquote. When I met him, he had compiled hundreds of oral accounts and was serializing them in the form of teaching material, as he called them. Some of these had already appeared in the form of locally produced books like Bouquet and Flashback. His work reveals not only the existence of pre-47 political projects centered on the idea of independence, but also a widespread disaffection within the National Conference over the question of accession with India. Zahiruddin emphasizes the critical importance of the Jammu Massacre, especially its silencing to understand the nature of elite consensus behind the Treaty of Accession. He also reveals how India effectively mobilized the imagery of tribal barbarians to discredit Kashmiri resistance to the Dogra monarchy. The same tactics, Zahiruddin says, were then used by India to discredit the 1990 Tehreek. There is, in fact, a third organizing logic to the Tehreek history writing, which has taken the form of chronicle, more or less in the way Hayden White defines it as an ostensibly narrative-less recording of calendrical events. Shakil Bakshi, part of the students' group that launched the 1990 armed movement, for instance, maintains an open, or what he calls a public diary, where he notes daily events in the form of Today in History. His accumulating diary, which he sometimes publishes on Facebook, whose form and reach suits his style well, he lists events like massacres, martyrdoms, arson by Indian soldiers, public statements of Tehreek leaders, visits of dignitaries, etc., that have occurred on a particular day. This mode of history writing creates what Alan Sekula has called a shadow archive of violence. It's an archive of the fractured or dismembered present, which might be discovered later, but of which no official record would have existed. Another dimension of Bakshi's writing, shared widely by younger activists, uses a counter-rhetorical mode. Here, India's own anti-colonial past is evoked to rebut official accusations and denunciations of the Tehreek. In defense of the armed resistance, sometimes the figure of communist revolutionary icon Bhagat Singh is evoked. Singh was hanged by the British for using violence against colonial officials, but is now celebrated in India. Sometimes even Gandhi's civil disobedience or Quit India campaign is drawn from to justify anti-occupation resistance. However, Gandhi, unlike Bhagat Singh, remains mostly a problematic figure. Gandhi is seen to have persuaded the Hindu monarch in 1947 to accede with India in contravention of the Kashmiri aspirations. He is also seen to have blessed post-colonial India's first major war, a military repression of the Kashmiri resistance along the regions that were forcibly depopulated and through which the line of control was eventually drawn. which is the border between India and Pakistan now. These organizing logics of Tehreek history writing, in my view, cannot be subsumed under the category of nationalist or ethnic history. They respond critically to the dominant nationalist paradigms. They mobilize a different set of images of the past than the material deployed in India to mass produce a nationalist imagination. They are troubling accounts that challenge the categories of the post-colonial archive. And to use Judith Butler's phrase, they trouble the subtle and yet not so subtle ruses of power. While Tehreek history writers are involved in a seditious recitation of history, we must not read their evolving accounts simply to find historical truths or as a more accurate history. We must instead trace the sharp focus they cast on the key assumptions of the official account, as well as on the nexus of power and knowledge within the post-colony. It might be of interest here that all the three Tehreek history writers that I mentioned grew up in the same neighborhood in Srinagar called Batmalun, one of the poorer sections of the city, crammed under the weight of a large, decades-old Indian military base. Batmalun was the scene of arson several times, first in 1930s, then 60s, and in 90s several times. But most dramatically in 1965, when Indian military burnt it down to punish the residents for supporting guerrillas who had crossed from Pakistani-controlled part of Kashmir. All the three writers were and are closely associated with the Tehreek. Akhtar Mahyuddin, who died in 2002, joined the Hurriyat conference for some time in the early 90s. Zahiruddin, a student activist at the time, has been closely aligned with the movement. And Shakil Bakshi, as I said, was part of the youth who picked up the arms. While my interest in bringing together the writings of these three Kashmiri writers is to evoke a restlessness with post-colonial historical representation, I also see in their works a clear sense of déjà vu. As they point out, comparing nationalist accounts of colonialism in India and the forms of state control in post-1947 Kashmir, one can't help but notice the resemblance. The Indian state had deployed the most violent of the colonial laws and practices in Kashmir. These writers invoke the colonial origins of laws like Armed Forces Special Powers Act that Angna mentioned earlier, and the Public Safety Act, which have imposed a permanent and punitive state of emergency in the region. Under these laws, these writers suggest Kashmiris form a structural component within a differential body politic. Within this system, Kashmiri lives are not deemed worth as much as Indian lives, and thus become imminently killable in the name of national interest. Our history writers and Kashmir opening a critical optic on what remains imperialistic within the post-colonial condition. What location are they speaking from? How must we theorize the relationship between the political society, those beneath the English-speaking national cultural elite, often presented as the heterogeneous vernacular subalterns, and those who still remain hidden within the deeper zones of invisibility and subalternity? I'm condensing a vast body of critical thought which traverses a range of problems that constitute the post-colonial condition. But here my intention has been to highlight a few key aspects as they concern Kashmir. I see Kashmir both as structurally connected to those other geographic regions, Palestine, Kurdistan, Elam, which are currently under neo-colonial forms of control, but also as an epistemic black hole within the critical theory that has specifically emerged in the understanding of India as a post-colony. Thank you.
Our second speaker is Richard Shapiro, who's Vice President of Education and Public Policy at Pixatel, an organization that works with innovative e-education in socially disadvantaged sites through fostering public-private partnerships. I would like to know, he's also been, he's been a faculty member in various departments at in social and cultural anthropology at California Institute of Integral Studies as chair and associate professor. He was director of humanities at New College of California, and he's a founding member of TODOS, Sherover Sims Institute for Alliance Building. He also co-founded Jewish-Muslim Friendship Circle with Kashmiri allies, which explains a lot of his presence here today. Anyway, I neglected to mention the title of our last speaker's paper, but I will at least mention the title of this paper, which is Deleuze's Nietzsche in Palestine. Excuse me for not mentioning yours. Richard Shapiro.
I would like to thank the Center for Palestine Studies for this event. I would also like to thank a few people. Thank you, Abdurrahim Al-Sheikh, for creating this opportunity for me and for perhaps the richest form of alliance, the alliance of friendship. Thank you for two readers of the longer essay from which this talk is derived, Abdul-Jan Mohammed for your precise insights and compelling questions, and Paolo Bacchetta for the embodied multiplicity that organizes your thinking and your generosity in sharing your thoughts. Finally, always thank you to Angana Chatterjee, in case you were wondering, for keeping exile a generative space of ongoing learning and deepening solidarities. Angana also says this essay is dense. Perhaps it's the writer who's dense, but we'll leave that to you to decide as I move to the talk. This essay, or this talk, consists of fragments from a longer essay called Deleuze's Nietzsche, Diagnosing Israeli Perpetrator Subjectivity. I'll begin with the abstract just to situate the talk in its larger context, and then move to the fragments from different sections of the paper. The perpetrator is among the myriad subjects constituted within the history of colonial and Eurocentric nation-state formation. The nation-building process constitutes perpetrators alongside citizens, enemies, refugees, natives, and others. The construction of the perpetrator-ruler is inseparable from the specific histories that produce the pre-perpetrator subjects who struggle to attain rule within a new state. These histories contribute to shaping the particular ways that perpetrators rule within nation-states, including settler colonies, performing their roles in organizing systemic forms of violence endemic to processes of governance. The move from subjugated peoples to perpetrator rulers who govern is an indeterminate process of transition that deserves critical diagnosis. This essay proposes that such a diagnosis benefits from the philosophical insights of Deleuze's 1962 work, Nietzsche and Philosophy. The use of this text is augmented through conversation with the work of Nietzsche, Freud, the Frankfurt School, Arendt, Fanon, Foucault, Derrida, Said, post-colonial feminisms, and queer and critical race theories. Specifically, the following question is addressed. How does Deleuze's Nietzsche facilitate an understanding of the constitution of the Ashkenazi Jewish male as perpetrator ruler in the state of Israel and in the occupation of Palestine? Further, how is the constitution of this particular perpetrator subject complicated by the Ashkenazi Jewish history of oppression in Christian Europe? How is a cultural inheritance forged through histories of oppression and resistance remade in pursuit of nation as marker of agency, autonomy, strength, and identity? How are these dynamics of subject constitution gendered, sexualized, and raced? What is sacrificed in the frenzied, methodical pursuit of nation? How may an analysis of these dynamics support critique that struggles for hospitality toward difference, new modes of subjectivation, and just forms of polity and governance? This essay presents itself as a thought experiment obligated by protracted social suffering, intransigent domination, and the imperative to interrupt historical progress as catastrophe. From the abstract to fragments. Deleuze uses Nietzsche to understand the political import of Nietzsche's thought for emancipatory social movements. He uses Nietzsche to shift from dialectics to a new metaphysics that affirms non-directional becoming, chance, and difference. Deleuze also draws on Nietzsche's analysis of the self as multiplicity and will as a relation of multiple forces to rethink the value of Nietzsche's analysis of types relevant to liberation struggles. For Deleuze, Nietzsche's view of types reveals dynamics that permeate present-day subjects. The subjectivation of the slave is preparatory to the subjectivation of the perpetrator. The oppressor and the oppressed both share existence as a type of human rooted in resentment and bad conscience. Master and slave inhabit the type organized by reactive forces. Active forces that enable thoughtfulness, care, and distinction necessary to respond to events, cultural heritage, and others with creativity and freedom recede. The intricate imbrication of master and slave, perpetrator and victim establish their identity, and this is an identity within the realm of what Nietzsche calls the reactively organized type is called man. The identity of master and slave as a political problem. In the reign of man, subject formation for the subjugated is primarily organized in relation to the perpetrator. The psychic, social, political, and historical displacement of the subjugated from relations to cultural heritage, local knowledge, events, and legacies of thought accompanies the occupation of the perpetrator as primary in the identity formation of the subjugated. The psychic displacement parallels the erosion of the world of the subjugated, including displacement from land, kinship relations, means of production, cultural forms, and language. To become a perpetrator subject requires forgetting cultural heritage, local knowledge, events, and legacies of thought. This forgetting is both an effect of the identity of master and slave in the order of oppression and a cause of subject formation that produces identification of slave with master. This helps address the question of the repetition of oppression as slaves become masters. For in Nietzsche's and Deleuze's diagnosis, the reign of man is the repetition of reactive subjectivity, where the imaginary of freedom is always already the product of an enslaved imagination. Master and slave collude to reproduce their identity and negate the production, circulation, and proliferation of difference. Difference as modes of subjectivation, forms of knowledge, ways of cultural expression, and experiments in political association. A double absence organizes perpetrator-subject formation: absence of rich relations with others outside the self, and absence of rich relations with cultural heritage, a key site of otherness within the self. Relations to others within the self are necessary to practices of resistance to oppression, to break the identification of slave to master. The other in me is the spectral presence, that is absent, of history, memory, knowledge, and thought. This haunting of the other in me, and all others, always more than one in me, is named by Derrida as hérité, inheritance and heritage, and by Foucault as local knowledge and counter-memory. For Deleuze, this other is a phantasmagoric force in corporal materialities that operate on the surfaces of bodies. Relations and alliances to others outside the self are also necessary to think critically and act ethically. Impoverished relations and alliances to others outside the self establishes itself through various strategies. One, denying the human worth of the other, including representation of the other as enemy, contagion, danger, threat, contaminant of racial purity, trickster, terrorist. Two, physical separation of the other through ghettoization. Gaza is a ghetto. Three, progressive elimination of the other from habitable space through, four, territorial expansion that displaces the other from land, that sacralized resource, mystical force, whose capture and transformation into territory defines the telos of settler colonialism. To silence the spectral presences that are absent of a cultural legacy prepares the perpetrator subject to silence those others not identified with the self. Israeli perpetrator subject formation grows out of impoverished relations to the multiple others intimate to self, constitutive of subaltern Jewish legacy. Distant from the sources facilitative of thoughtful, caring, ethical action, the other outside the self is vanquished through silence that eliminates the other as a speaking, visible being, as conditioned to eliminate the other from polity and territory. Violence in relation to others outside the self gains sustenance through violence in relation to others intimate to self. Next fragment from Reactive Subjectivity and Euro-Christian Dominance. To become a normative human being is to become an individual and a human being, with no active relation to legacies of political struggle, local knowledge, counter-memory, or cultural inheritance. Insofar as a third term mediates self-understanding of what kind of individual and human being one is, that term is nation. The most, quote-unquote, advanced normative subject within a nation is that subject with greatest proximity to whiteness. Whiteness, itself proximate to Christianness, that's a neologism, occupies the privileged site of the normative human. In Israel, the Ashkenazi male, through proximity to whiteness and Christianness, holds a privileged relation to the normative human. To become a subject organized as an individual and human being first involves disdain and embarrassment toward and reduction of the languages, stories, knowledge, practices, memories, imaginations, relational forms, and spirits of ancestors, living and dead. The catastrophe of progress is built upon subject formation, producing individualization and humanization. The dominant Zionist narrative of Jewish time as originary nationhood, the long history of diaspora as fall, and a return to nationhood reproduces dominant Euro-Christian narratives of time as a retreat and return of the origin. This narrative structure as official state history fuels loss of relation to counter-memory as a source of resistance to dominance and a space of hope for redemption as universal justice. A tradition of Jewish thought linking humans and God in a covenant, an alliance, berit in Hebrew, that places a burden of responsibility on the Jew for the other, for justice, and for a narrative of history in which the future is open, knowledge is incomplete, and the redemptive promise requires continual attention, erupting in a radical rupture with the continuum of time, is replaced by a provincial relation to the Jewish people as the concern of the state, and a linking to the Euro-Christian universal that presents liberal capitalist nationhood as the culminating form of human association. Israel as a Jewish state signifies this simultaneous provincialism of the new Jew and the assimilation of the Jewish people into the identity of the Euro-Christian liberal universal. Identification with dominance is mistaken for mature selfhood, real politic for agency and history. Through the reactivity of Ashkenazi Israeli perpetrator rule, Israel has gained membership in the dominant movement of history, a valued participant in global Latinization, Derrida's term. Next fragmented from section, Becoming a Perpetrator Ruler, a Genealogy of the Ashkenazi Male. For the Ashkenazi male to become a perpetrator subject in Israel requires conformity with dominant gender socialization, forms of racialization, and imaginaries of mature selfhood justifying mastery and nationhood. The becoming master of the Ashkenazi Jewish male entails intimate identification with the forms of subjectivation defining whiteness out of a Euro-Christian legacy. For Jews to become national subjects, the Jews must become Goyim. Goyim signifies both Gentile other and nation. The Jews of diaspora were a nationality without a nation. For the diasporic Jew, the other was the one with a nation. The Jew was the one in exile. To become a Jew with a nation is to become a Goy. Get a Goy, nation, become a Goy, Gentile as normative, mature human. With the reduction of Zionism to a settler colonial project, securing a nation state became the telos of Jewish liberation/maturation. In identifying mature, powerful male subjectivity with ruler of state, the Ashkenazi Israeli male reveals the degree to which Jewish liberation has been reduced to mimicry of Euro-Christian modes of governing and forms of subjectivation. The multiple sources and forms organizing Zionist movements have become reduced to the project of a Jewish state that mimics the Euro-Christian nation state and seeks its place in the order of militarized, masculinist, racist, neoliberal capitalist societies. A state for Jews outside the space of Europe that succeeded in its quest to rid itself of Jews is not equivalent to a Jewish state. A state for Jews should mean a state for all those considered others, or the disparaged, downtrodden, devalued, discarded, and mistreated beings of the world. A state for Jews should mean a democratic state, a socialist polity organized to ensure equality, justice, and freedom to all its inhabitants. The history of the Israeli state is a history of becoming a closer clone of Protestant neoliberal capitalism by reducing social welfare, fetishizing the market, expanding its influence through military aggression, and rewarding individualistic subject formation and privatization of resources and visions of the good life. The Jewish state has reached its current form by shutting out the differences within Jewry, reproducing Euro-Christian racial hierarchies by asserting the superiority of Ashkenazim over Sephardim, Mizrahim, and other Jews. This practice has succeeded in producing reactive resistance to putative Ashkenazi superiority, as cultural assertion of Sephardic and Mizrahi Jewry takes the form of banning books and demanding more patriotic music on the military radio station. The Jewish state has reached its current form by treating Palestinians as the nations of Europe treated its Jews, or as the settler colonies of North America, Australia, South Africa, and New Zealand treated its indigenous peoples. Against an ethos of justice, realpolitik has ruled the day. Reality is the reality of reactive forces and dominance, of thoughtlessness and brutality as an inevitable outcome of the reign of man. To forget hérité in the name of redeeming hérité is its own particular abomination. To claim that Israel, in its delusion as simultaneously invulnerable and constantly under siege, has made a safe haven for Jews is to fall prey to the masculinist logic that reduces security to superior brute force, forever in denial of what happens to those who live by the sword. The Ashkenazi male Israeli perpetrator exemplifies the type of being reactively organized. The master said the Ashkenazi male is weak, effeminate, clever in a manipulative way attributed to women, and incapable of labor, of defending himself, of taking charge of his existence and not living as a parasite feeding off the real labor of others. The Ashkenazi male Israeli perpetrator has reversed the master narrative by claiming to be everything the master said the Jewish male is not, and proving it through the way he reacts as ruler of state. Becoming a big man has made the world of the Israeli Ashkenazi male perpetrator smaller as the sources of creative resistance and subject formation in motion as for freedom recede from the world of the perpetrator subject. The establishment of a hierarchy of difference within the Jewish people facilitates the obliteration of the other that is intimate to self. This includes Ashkenazim over Sephardim, followed by Mizrahim and others with dubious claims to quote-unquote, dubious claims to Jewishness, like Ethiopian Jews. Proximity to Euro-Christianity as a constituent element in whiteness bestows upon the Ashkenazi Jew racial superiority over the non-European and access to the unmarked normative human that promises maturity and enlightenment through statehood. The diaspora Jew is below the state Jew, both in the present with regard to legitimate understandings of the mandate of securing a future for Jews, and in relation to the value of a diasporic subaltern heritage to building the state of Israel. Separation from the oppressed subject position produced through exile, demands of conversion, and eventual annihilation involves a reduction of diasporic Jewry to a lack that may be overcome through state, a weakness requiring the strength of state, a wound only healed by state. Orthodox religion occupies a privileged relation to the state, even while Orthodox youth are exempted from military service. Diasporic Judaism and secular Jews within the state of Israel and outside, largely the US, exist on a continuum that deems different ways of being Jews from inferior to not really Jews. The hierarchy places contemporary Hebrew as a language of freedom above Yiddish, Ladino, or Arabic. The languages of diaspora are deemed inadequate to a free people, forged through histories of Jewish impotence and weakness. Arabic-speaking Jews are made better Jews, Jews of state, by renouncing ties to language and culture that mark proximity to the enemy other, the Palestinian in particular, and the Arab in general. The voice of value is the voice of the state. All other voices are inconsequential to truth and sovereignty. Those Jews strategically placed to enable peaceful cooperation and communication with Palestinians are indoctrinated into the trauma of European Jewry, where all non-Jews are under suspicion, and the Holocaust is definitive of the Jewish relation to non-Jews. In the logic of the perpetrator subject, those who cannot be trusted understand only the language of dominance. We must become them to overcome them while declaring the incommensurability of Jewish experience to silence all dissent. Next section fragments from Israeli perpetrator subjectivity and Palestinians. The assumption of Israeli perpetrator identity is predicated on privileging the Euro-Christian in subject formation. The Palestinian suffers from this perpetrator subject, while entirely absent in the process that forms the Israeli perpetrator subject. The identification of the Ashkenazi male come Israeli ruler with the racialized and gendered norms of Euro-Christian masculinity reveals the absence of the Palestinian in the formation of the subject who rules the Palestinian. The Israeli perpetrator, ruler, mistreats the Palestinian as the Euro-Christian master mistreated the Jew. The Israeli perpetrator subject emerged through intimate identification with the Euro-Christian master. The Euro-Christian master did not mistreat the Jew in a manner that emerged from the ways that Jews lived in the space of the master. The Jew was mistreated based on the anxieties and identity of the Euro-Christian master. The history of Euro-Christian anti-Semitism is a history of Euro-Christian projections on the Jew, unrelated to the lived reality of Jews. To constitute the self, the Christian self, as holding a monopoly on truth, on moving toward the universal salvation realization of humans, the Jew needed to be presented as an ignorance to be converted, an impurity to be exiled, or a threat to be annihilated. The three primary means by which Euro-Christian perpetrator rulers addressed the quote-unquote Jewish question have been aptly summarized. You cannot live among us as Jews, conversion. You cannot live among us, exile. You cannot live, annihilation. That's from Raoul Hilberg's Holocaust studies. These relations of the perpetrator ruler to the Jew are marked precisely by their lack of relation to actual Jews and the cultural worlds they inhabited. Ashkenazi male Israeli perpetrator rulers reactively reproduce this dynamic in their non-relation to Palestinians. The Zionist project has increasingly taken the form of vanquishing the demons tormenting Ashkenazi male Jewry. The reactivity of the traumatized slave in transition to perpetrator-ruler, organized state formation, and articulates itself with expanding force. The Palestinian is a phantasmagoric image, a substitute for the Euro-Christian oppressor. On the Palestinian, the Ashkenazi male Israeli perpetrator projects the image of the Euro-Christian master, most fully through the equation of the Arab in general and the Palestinian in particular with German Nazis. Israeli children are taught that the Nazis wanted to destroy the Jews, and now the Arabs and Palestinian Arabs want to destroy the Jews. There's nothing original in the nation-building strategy of unifying disparate groups through construction of a common enemy. And such processes always involve systematic campaigns of misinformation, fear-mongering, and segregation of those deemed to be enemies from the means of expression in the public sphere. Palestinian efforts to live on their land as free people are mistaken for terrorism seeking the annihilation of Jews. The delusional create a world proximate to their delusions to the degree to which they shape the other into reactively organized subjects. Every reaction on the part of Palestinians that congeal the identity of Palestinian and Israeli, of occupied and occupier, of slave and master, serve to bolster the delusions of the Israeli perpetrator. Entry into the order of identity and master and slave operates to reinforce the delusional regime of truth of the Israeli ruler, fueling the delusional drive to eliminate the Palestinian, the enemy that is one with Euro-Christian anti-Semites, whose defeat is promised through putative redemption in Israel to secure the future of the Jews. There is no resistance to the forms of perpetrator subjectivity forged through dominant Euro-Christian discourses and practices without affirming the multiplicities of self inscribed in subaltern legacies. The Ashkenazi perpetrator subject, once racialized as inferior, asserts equality with the European as European. The dominant Euro-Christian racial order is incorporated into Ashkenazi male Israeli subjectivity. The dominant narrative is reproduced rather than revalued. The non-European remains inferior, justifying rule by Europeans. Jewish legacy that refuses Euro-Christian racial hierarchies and reveals complexity is disavowed, as assimilation into master race trumps the eradication of racialization historically pushed by diasporic Jews. Last fragments from conclusion. In the continual conflict between Israel as a Jewish state and Israel as a democratic state, the Jewish state increasingly solidifies itself. What has to happen to a Jewish cultural legacy for democracy and justice to be antithetical to Jewishness in the political sphere? Israel as a state safe for Jews would require a different imaginary of liberation that links the work of Tikkun Olam, the repair and healing of the world, to the ongoing work of justice that places the stranger, the dispossessed, the stateless at the center of such work. A state for the Jews in such an imaginary must necessarily be a state that is first and foremost a state for all those who wander without a home, for all those who are despised as other. A state for Jews must mean a state for the oppressed, and the Jew that symbolizes exilic wandering in search of justice must be a strength from which Jewish activism continually springs forth. The subaltern diasporic Jew is not the victim of history, but emerges again and again as its critical critic and ethical conscience. The male Ashkenazi Israeli perpetrator mimics the subjectivity of the dominant and seeks full belonging in the order of masculinist, heteronormative, racially hierarchical, militarized, and neoliberal capitalist nation states. There is nothing exceptional about the male Ashkenazi Israeli perpetrator. Those international critics who locate this figure as a particularly heinous form of atrocity must reflect on Euro-Christian dominance and inherited anti-Semitism. Nor is the male Ashkenazi Israeli perpetrator one who may reject critique of the injustice of Israeli rule as a product of anti-Semites and self-hating Jews. The Israeli male Ashkenazi perpetrator subject is a subject who has forgotten and forgotten that he has forgotten. Such a subject has forgotten non-heteronormative modes of gendering bodies deemed male. Such a subject has forgotten diasporic history. Such a subject has forgotten his particularity. Such a subject has forgotten the plurality of the Jewish community. Such a subject has forgotten the learning enabled by exile, by the forms of non-belonging that compel critical intellect and ethical relatedness. Such a subject has forgotten the legacy of alliance with subaltern struggles marking diasporic Jewish history. Such a subject has forgotten Benjamin's Jetzeit, that now time, that weak messianic force that shoots through history, enabling the work of justice even in the most degraded of spaces in the time of cynical, celebratory forgetfulness. Such a subject has forgotten Palestinians through systematic misidentification of this proximate other. Such a subject would rather forget and pursue the abominable sacred with certainty and brutality than remember and extend hospitality to disparate others.
Thank you both. I learned from my predecessor that I'm not just officiating, I can comment. I'll say a few words. First, the very interesting paper on history writers. The notion appeals to me. I'm very interested in writing in general, and I was most interested towards the end of the paper in the question of the three logics. The logics of this kind of writing, this kind of textuality that involves things like microhistories, oral accounts serialized, public diaries posted on Facebook. This is totally fascinating. I would like to hear a great deal more about the materialities of this work, the kind of reportage, if it could be called that goes into it, the kind of work that goes into it, the kind of production, the circulation of these kinds of texts. And I would also be very interested to think about whether there are comparisons, whether there are a similar kind of textuality that has responded in the other two contexts that we're talking about today. Or, is there something analogous? Is at least in the notion these are history writers, that there's a kind of genre here and a kind of logic that can be seen in their work. Could there be an equivalent analysis of some other kind of production in the Palestinian context or in the Sri Lankan context? I'm sure there probably is, but to think that comparison would be, you legitimated what you said, Nakba call it, in terms of the Kashmir situation. What kind of other, we were interested this morning in the imaginations that emerged from these incredible experiences of trying to come to cemeteries and find those who were unrecognized in their internments. And what kind of imagination goes on in this kind of work? This is a very exciting, imaginative project, a political project as well. Just a comment about the perpetrator ruler, the perpetrator subject. That too, I would imagine, especially in the notion that the perpetrator was once the subjugated. That whole history that is so crucial to the European history and the Ashkenazi white male in your particular case, how might that be extrapolated? Then it would really, for me, require a kind of historical specificity of the Kashmiri perpetrator. Who is that individual there once under colonial rule? And who, in the case of the Sinhalese and the Tamils, who were both under colonial rule, and who is that perpetrator subject there? And is that analysis something that can be pushed beyond the Israeli case, beyond the Jewish, European, Israeli case? And were the delusions of those perpetrators interestingly similar? And if a different imaginary is to be advocated for them, would there be similarities? In other words, again, I was sort of appreciating the non-statement of the comparison in the morning, but now I have the afternoon brings a demand for pushing some of these questions that have been raised in comparative terms. If you like to respond, or else we can turn to the audience for assistance.
Yeah, I think that, thank you so much. I was actually listening to Abdul Rahim in the morning very carefully when he talked about Palestine as a metaphor. And I think it's, although you want to recover some of the real Palestine behind the metaphor itself, but in places like Kashmir, and I can only talk about Kashmir here, Palestine resonates in very profound ways. When I said call it Nakba, people talk about this foundational violence that took place in 1947. They have been not been able to articulate it so well for so long, but increasingly learning about what happened in Palestine, what happened elsewhere, it's easier for them to begin to bring the fragments of this memory together and to construct this event as foundational to their understanding what has happened in Kashmir. So I think that while we're trying to recover the real Palestine, there is a salience to the metaphor, to the idea of global Palestine, which is very important. And I think that, although you mentioned this is a question to all the participants today, the circulation of these other forms of remembering or keeping the archive alive, these are places where circulation really does not take place. You know, these are spaces which are interrupted. Only yesterday, the Indian government imposed a 5-day ban on the internet. So my friend Shakil Bakshi's diary could not circulate on the internet to his audiences. It was in response to, a soldier molesting a young Kashmiri girl, to which some of her Kashmiri, goat town dwellers, they protested, and the soldiers started shooting, killing 4 young boys and a middle-aged woman. And after which the entire Kashmir was put under this lockdown, both physical as well as internet lockdown. So in a way, these are not circulations in my mind. These are eruptions that happen in Kashmir. And that's why I think that we need to keep that in mind, that these are circulations which are continuously interrupted by the state.
I think, is this on?
Yes.
In terms of cycles of oppression and the ways in which perpetrators were once themselves subjugated, and in multiple ways, in ways that are gendered, raced, classed, what have you. Certainly I think it's been relevant to looking at things like Hindutva in India, where you have a colonized people, you have men who have been emasculated through colonization, and then become, cadre for an extremely misogynist, masculinist, xenophobic, movement. I think we see these dynamics. I think this has been a primary dynamic in all revolutionary contexts, in decolonization contexts, and it remains, I think, a key question for all of us of what is it that keeps these dynamics in place, where movements that have had very progressive ideals then turn into the new gatekeepers and torturers of the new states. And certainly I find it helpful to think in terms of the intersectionalities, but also the ways in which there is a normative ideal that I think is dominant, that does come out of ways in which Euro-Anglo-Christianity has stood for the universal and has sort of been, a cultural tradition that says our truth is a culture-free truth and all other truths are culture-bound truths, and that some of the work that has to happen is to look at the ways in which putative, notions of the human are themselves linked to that history of dominance have within forms of subjectivity, Euro-Anglo-Christian notions, in terms of norms of governance, in terms of relations to truth, that in all these cases, there is that dominance that's still insufficiently marked. I think we have people here who've done a tremendous job of marking Euro-Christianity. But yes.
Could we turn it, discussion briefly, for a few minutes to the audience for questions, comments? There is a microphone there if you want. I mean, we're not that big a group that maybe we need it, but.
It's actually a question for Shapiro. Thank you for your lecture. I wonder if one can even complicate your paper, because I don't think that the Jews coming, the Mizrahi Jews coming to Palestine and later to Israel were not going already before a big systematic process of what I would call Europeanization. The Jewish Joint and the Alliance Française were heavily investing in making them actually European before they moved from the Arab lands to Palestine. So it would be even complicated to start to think on this situation in Palestine, not only with the Ashkenazi Jews, as you described them, but also with some of the Mizrahi Jews that came to Palestine.
Should we take, I mean, I think that's precisely the dynamic that has occurred, where it's both Mizrahim should be Europeanized, and in that sense should be made more like Ashkenazi Jews, but at the same time should be a pale copy of that, so that they will still accept a second-class citizenship that's at least above the Palestinian, but below the Ashkenazim, that should accept being placed in border areas where there's greater risk, and should, and in that European becoming European or becoming Ashkenazi dynamic, to disregard the plurality of Jewish history and the particularity of their own history. So the Holocaust has to symbolically become the great trauma that they experienced as well, and that therefore they built the Mizrahim as a right-wing voting bloc. But it's not just a critique, it's how all subaltern groups also survive through proximity to dominance. And that's a strategy that is used over and over again, and it's a strategy that will be used until proximity to resistance actually allows people to live. Enough counter-hegemonic institutions are shaped where enough resistance is developed where people can imagine a life there instead of often both fear-based but also a certain kind of self-interest that says, the closer I get to empire, the closer I get to dominance, the better my chances of survival.
Mine is a sort of comment or question for Junaid. When we think about connections between Palestine and Kashmir, while we can think about many similarities, but I just wanted to point out a structural difference in terms of the discourse. So while in the case of Palestine, there will be a politics of exclusion where the Palestinians are thought not belonging to a certain place and that place and being pushed out. While in case of Kashmir, the enforced violence is also of a forced identity, like you belong to us, and both are similarly violent. And thinking about other connections, I remember the term intifada being used repeatedly for the protests of 2008 and 2010, so one more resonance. And I remember last time Gaza was being bombed, there was a protest against the Israeli government in Srinagar, and one boy was also killed, so real material connections. Yeah, thanks.
this is fragments from a longer work, so there are sections that do address much more, you know, the reality of the settler colonial project. I think at the same time, the ways, if one looked, for example, at the Israeli educational system, you see the way in which a certain trauma, but also a certain entitlement is handed down, you know, and a certain official narrative about the Jews in relation to the land of, you know, quote unquote Israel is perpetuated, and in ways that require dulling faculties for critical thinking, in ways that require invisibilizing Jewish history and its the ethos that has organized much of it in terms of critical thought and justice as a covenant with God, you know, and so I think those things need to be denied, and I think that the reality of the Palestinian has to be denied in ways that are linked to just shutting off a self from its own subaltern legacy. And if one would look at where does resistance come from, I don't think it comes from simply the dynamics of master-slave dialectic. I mean, that's the other side of Deleuze's argument, is the dialectic is insufficient to get at these dynamics because one has to find resistance from someplace else. The identitarian thought or identity philosophy is too self-referential, and one has to find ways to break down those identities and those frames for truth, and find an outside where resistance might be strengthened. And that outside, I think, is every people's relation to not just their own subaltern legacies or to local knowledge or hérité, but to others as well. In other words, it's not just that a Jew should get sustenance from Jewish subaltern legacies. No, anyone concerned with justice should get sustenance from every subaltern legacy, and it should be of interest to them. But I agree with you, we are talking about a settler colonial context in which, but it's how do you make Bedouin lands, you know, so central to the state when nobody cares about those, nobody needs those lands. You have to create another kind of imaginary that says our existence is threatened if we have a rational relation to the others who live here and want them to also partake of this land. You know, it's not reason that governs these dynamics, or simply political economic logic, or, you know, the rationality of relation to territory. There's something else that we have to get at, I think.
Do you want to respond to the former questioner? We moved rather quickly.
Well, I mean, I think that was more like a additional comment to it. But I would just say that, yes, precisely some of the techniques, discursive techniques that have been deployed in the Palestinian-Israeli situation has been employed in Kashmir too. As I said earlier, that there is this entire notion that Kashmir is a Hindu space. There's a long tradition of that thought within Indian nationalism, in which the Muslims are seen as just the surface, you know, who can either be assimilated because of their gentler Islam, if they're willing to accept their subaltern position, or, I mean, but something which is the uglier side of that nationalism, which really talks the language of genocide, which talks the language of extermination, and wants Kashmiris to go to Pakistan if they want azadi. You know, so yes, there is the constitutional inclusion that you are citizens of India, but there are much larger and more vicious processes of exclusion and extermination that are in place.
Maybe we should, at this point, close this session and thank our two speakers. And we can move on to my colleague, Nadia Abul-Haj, for closing remarks. Get out of the way. The seat's already warm. You want the
Okay, well, hi. I've been given the task, honor, and I think misplaced role, perhaps, of giving some closing remarks. So, first of all, thank you to our lovely Fulbright fellow, who I have been absent from all year, for organizing this day. And what I'm going to do is, oh, that is loud. I'm not going to kind of re-rehearse what Brink nicely talked about earlier about a lot of the documentary elements of these papers, because that stuff has been laid out very well, but just try to think across them a little bit. And you're going to have to bear with me. Partly I had slightly shortened or different drafts of a couple of the papers, so we'll see what happens. Okay. Let me begin by quoting from Mohammed Junaid's paper. Referring to the Kashmiri history writers, he tells us, quote, "I see in their works a clear sense of déjà vu, as they themselves are wont to say or write, reading nationalist accounts of colonialism in India and the forms of state control in post-1947 Kashmir, they couldn't help but notice the resemblances," unquote. Now, reading across the different historical and political domains, as have the papers today, one also gets the sense of experiencing the resemblances. So in my closing remarks, I'm going to sketch some of those resemblances, those thematic resemblances as I see them. And I'm going to do so in order to think about the various kinds of insights and distinctions the papers offer for us in terms of our thinking about the politics of life and death in these different locales. So I'm going to begin with the question of the dead, and I will begin with Abdul Rahim's paper. So in this paper on cemeteries and the life of the dead in Palestine, Abdul Rahim torques the meaning of the politics of death away from its configuration as necropolitics, although I don't want to suggest there's anything in the paper that necessarily undermines a necropolitical reading of contemporary Palestine, to which I'm not particularly wedded. I'm just going to mark that. His reading of the Palestinian living cemetery and the dead themselves, so to speak, asks in effect, what do the dead do? I want to emphasize his is not an account of the dead as haunting the present. That is, this is not an account of the dead living on as uncanny reminders of unresolved grief or unknown histories, as they are in some of the other papers. Rather, in my reading, this is an account of the dead and of their places of residence, so to speak, that reads the dead as material artifact subjects, for lack of a better term. On the one hand, the dead and their cemeteries stand as evidence against absence and erasure. The Mamilla Cemetery, the cemetery in Jaffa, for example, the Mamilla Cemetery, as Abdul Rahim notes, is, quote, the oldest Arab cemetery in Jerusalem, a public Islamic waqf and the historical burial site in which some graves date back to the time of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, unquote. And yet on top of that Jerusalem cemetery, and partially on the site of the Jaffa Cemetery, Muslim museums to tolerance and dialogue have been built. The cemetery's very presence then disrupts the Zionist historical narrative of the land, just as their presence disrupts the claims to tolerance and dialogue, to liberal humanism itself, presumably embodied in the centers to be built over the graves. In effect, the cemeteries are counterhistories. As facts on the ground, they bear a resemblance to the more active project of history writing in Kashmir that Mohammed discusses in his paper. Of course, the dead and their places of rest, however, do not simply exist as evidence or as counterhistory. As Abdul Rahim has worked to produce the archive itself, epitaph pictures, audio and video interviews, some of which we saw, historical documents. And as he has done so in order to, quote, unearth the concealed features of the political, social, and cultural histories of, I need like a thing here, okay, of modern Palestine through cemeteries, through narrating the life of the dead, unquote. He has done so, in other words, to tell stories that challenge not just the Zionist work of erasure, but the nationalist terms through which resistance to it most often finds its mimetic form. Thinking the dead then also emerges as the grounds for a new political imaginary. Now, in Angana Chatterjee's paper, one also sees political imaginary and evidence intersect through a recuperation of the dead. Most centrally, there are the bodies as evidence. She tells the story of a political project documenting graves in Kashmir, archives of violence, and more specifically of gendered violence. There are 2,700 unknown and unmarked graves that are discovered in a project recuperation and 2,943 bodies. It's interesting in contrast here to the paper on Palestine that whereas in putting Palestinian bodies in graves that are merely numbered, right, is a project of erasure in that paper, but here, in fact, counting becomes a process of represencing, right? The significance of the findings, then, quote, these endangered archives are imprinted with gendered violence and grief and loss across shifting political and metaphoric ruptures, unquote. The documentation of the dead provides the grounds for testimony to the atrocities committed in Kashmir. And to function as evidence, the researchers need to establish to the extent possible what kinds of bodies these were or are: civilians versus militants, Muslims or Hindu, male or female, local civilians or foreign insurgents. In other words, in this forensic project of the grave as evidence, one cannot simply supersede or reject the terms, the categories through which power itself operates, even if only a fraction of the recovered bodies could in fact be identified as such. In the context then of Chatterjee's account, this provides testimony before European Human Rights Commissions, the establishment of a People's Tribunal, and that structures both the kinds of evidence one needs, but also it provides an institutional structure, even if a counter-institutional one, within which such evidence might be acknowledged. So I want to think a bit then about acknowledgement, and I'm going to return to Abdurrahim's paper to do this. Keeping in mind, and when I do it, I'm keeping in mind the question of the political and ethical value of knowing, of remembering, or of knowing through the dead that runs through several of these papers. What work and for whom does this archive do, the archive of the Palestinian cemeteries? There are several answers to that question in the paper. And I want to focus on one here, and then I'll return to a different one a little later. The archive produces or stands for, in effect, a counter-history to the erasure upon which Zionism is premised, which I talked about above. And what I'm saying may or may not have relevance to writing counter-history in Kashmir. I suspect the project might be a little different. It is true that erasure or not knowing is it still true that erasure or not knowing stands at the heart of Zionism today? Yes, there's the ongoing act of continuing erasures, building a museum of tolerance over the Mamilla Cemetery, for example. But I'm no longer certain that erasure functions ideologically or in the political imaginary in the way it once did. Since the rise of the post-Zionist historians in the 1980s, the project of unearthing the Nakba has been gaining steam. One might say in large swaths of Israeli society today, it is now known, admitted even, that the establishment of the Jewish state was premised on the destruction of Palestine and the expulsion of the vast majority of its inhabitants. But what political difference does knowing that make? It's also increasingly claimed, in effect, that it doesn't matter, in effect. It is what we had to do. Some people like Benny Morris says we should have done a better job. As fortunate as it is, that was the only way to establish the Jewish state. Perhaps, besides Benny Morris, think of Ari Shavit's book, My Promised Land, right? It kind of uncovers this whole project of destruction, performs a kind of moral angst, and moves on. In other words, one may, and by the way, that book was unbelievably well reviewed in the US. In other words, one may know the Nakba and yet refuse to acknowledge it. As Linda Zarelli writes, and here she's drawing on Hannah Arendt, what can and cannot be acknowledged resides in part in that problem of the we. I'm paraphrasing, I'm not quoting. Who is the we that is to acknowledge this act? That is, who is the we that might recognize the Nakba as politically and ethically significant, something which must be redressed? In that sense, there's perhaps no real possibility for a mere presence, as Abdurrahim names the process of sitting with the archive rather than theorizing it, at least not as a counter-history that speaks to audiences other than a Palestinian we. And maybe that doesn't matter. I struggle with this in everything I write, but it reminds me of something you said at the end, Mohammed, which is how, in effect, in reading this counter-history, does one respond not by focusing on the facts, because the project is the kind of framework that challenges the facts per se. In this instance, how does one challenge a colonial common sense that no longer denies per se what was done necessarily, but that refuses to recognize it or acknowledge it as morally and politically significant? Okay. Of course, the dead are doing more than functioning as an archive in this paper, and here, this is where I think Abdelrahim's twist on thinking the dead is extremely powerful. What might it mean to think the agency of the dead as active subjectivity? The dead of the present, and presumably the future, who continue to make claims upon the land. This is the dead, right? Ibrahim Abu-Lughad's return to Jaffa, or the bodies buried inside 1948 by Israeli authorities who want to undermine Palestinian politics, but in fact, by burying them inside 1948, these dead as agents in effect make claim to the land. Okay, so let me now return to Angus Chatterjee's paper. Investigating the graves in that paper as well, identifying bodies, remembering the dead, it has far more than an evidentiary function. Living with the dead is what surviving in Kashmir involves, as she tells us. Remembering the dead is then also an act of resistance, one that torments a villager who was forced to bury the dead. Witnessing, remembering that labor of burying the dead is an act of political and ethical obligation. Here, the presence of the dead, and the dead as reminders of the ways in which death-bound subjects, in which people living in Kashmir are always already death-bound subjects. My notes are such a mess at this point, I just have to tell you. Function as a counter-memory that is essential to producing particular kinds of political and ethical subjects, all the while, as we're reminded, putting those subjects increasingly at risk for the very possibility of not surviving itself. So in that paper, I think in powerful ways, the dead are essential also to thinking about the process of subjectivation, both as a disciplining project and as the possibility for resistance, which is kind of doing a different job. Okay, memory. Remembering the trauma and or as mourning the trauma stands at the center of several papers. I'm gonna talk first about Sharon's paper. In the face of genocide, I mean, it's clearly very central to Chatterjee's paper as well. In the face of genocide, whose very project is that of commemorating and celebrating, this is a quote, our own while destroying and eliminating the other, remembering plays a particular role in this paper. Countering Adorno's initial claim about the impossibility of poetry after Auschwitz, Sharon writes, quote, it could be argued that poetry after apocalypse may be a way to simultaneously transmit and mourn the trauma and unimaginable suffering, unquote. It is a means of refusing closure. That is, that lessons have been learned and reconciliation achieved, although I do share Gil's desire sometimes for reminding us of the importance of forgetting, but I do also realize that Israel is a very different context in this. What is striking here, however, is an opening towards another refusal that I see in this paper. Not just a refusal of closure, but the possibility opened up here of a refusal of the general claim about the failure of language in the face of extreme horror. There can be no poetry after Auschwitz, after all, is a way of not just sustaining the uniqueness of the Holocaust, in its extremity at least, but also has become a language that many a scholar, especially in the humanities in the US, has taken up as a given. Now, the paper I got, sort of the end, in fact, is 4 poems, but you didn't actually get to hear them today, but so just bear with me. Before turning to the poetry in the paper, Sharon addresses the question of how his poetry and social science meet, which he also talked about here. And in so doing, he makes very clear that he's not juxtaposing poetry, that which can represent, to social science, that which cannot represent the apocalypse. They are both imaginative projects, he answers. Through language, he invites us then, at the end of this paper, through poetry, but he invites us, quote, to a deeper and profound understanding of genocide, occupation, and internment. In other words, in thinking social science as always an imaginative project, he opens up the possibility that it is not just poetry that can be made to speak. It is that through their mutual encroachment, poetry and social science can actually be made to speak, as he says, after the apocalypse. And I want to point out here, there's a sort of, and it's got to do with something I'm working on, there's an extension in American sort of public domain. It's not new, but it's increasingly powerful today, I think, because not because, I think, in these post-9/11 wars, that one sees the repetition of this question of the idea of the failure of language is also a claim to witnessing, to what it means to have been there, and what you cannot know, of course, if you were not there, right? And that is a language that's very powerful in the post Iran, and they're not really post, but for most American troops and veterans they are. There's literature that's emerging out of US veterans who fought in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the ways in which that's being positioned precisely in that language of witnessing, that they are the privileged witnesses of what war is, even though we can only hope to begin to approximate that experience because language itself will fail. So that question of what that does, that argument about language, I think has a very profound double-edged politics. In other words, it's really appropriated powerfully on the part of what one would talk about as the perpetrator. Okay. I have no idea how long I've been talking, but I'm getting there. Trauma. Let me turn to trauma. Trauma, the experience or fact of trauma, of traumatized subjects, of collective trauma, of the imperative to remember, to never forget, which is inseparable from the discourse of trauma. This also runs through several of the papers. I'm going to turn to Richard Shapiro's paper here. This is an account of perpetrator identity, that is, more specifically, the Ashkenazi male Israeli perpetrator. And I should say I think I was blessed not to get the beginning philosophical Deleuze account, so I can just not deal with it right here. What I am going to focus on here is the fragment on Israeli perpetrator subjectivity and Palestinians. Okay. So key to the story, and particularly in that fragment of the Ashkenazi male Israeli perpetrator, is the quote, the trauma of European Jewry. And partly this has been talked about with you and Harish, but I want to revisit it. I quote, "What is perhaps unique in the context of Israeli settler colonial enemy production is the degree to which historically produced trauma organizes perpetrator subjectivity," unquote. From within that history, I quote again, "The Palestinian is a phantasmagoric image, a substitute for the Euro-Christian oppressor. On the Palestinian side, I must be missing a word, on the Palestinian, the Ashkenazi male projects the image of the Euro-Christian master most fully through the equation of the Arab in general and the Palestinian in particular with German Nazis," unquote. I want to question this framing of the historical dynamic of Zionist subjugation, of Zionist subjectivity, as much as I respect the political intent here. The whole notion of collective, and again, we talked about this a bit now, so maybe we can flesh it out a little more, but because I'm not clear in the paper how you think about that collective trauma. But what I read from what I read, the notion of collective trauma and its claim on into, in other words, I'm responding to what I read. The notion of collective trauma and its claim on into history and, of course, on into ethics is itself the product of a post-World War II period, and not simply to the fact of individuals or families traumatized by their experiences in the Holocaust. In other words, even European Jewry or Ashkenazi Jewry is not simply, and certainly not 2-3 generations later, traumatized by the Holocaust. It is a product of the Holocaust industry, as people have named it, that produced the Holocaust as the grounds, produced the Holocaust and produced it as the grounds on which claims to the present and future would be made. History as trauma, then, or as the enactment and experience of trauma as a requirement to remember, has become a master signifier of its own, and not just in the hallowed halls of social theory. It has also become a widespread collective idiom of what Didier Fassin has called humanitarian reason, and Robert Meister has critiqued as the abandonment of the politics of rights in favor of an idiom of suffering and the call to protect. The whole turn to human rights, says the language of politics, in fact, is itself born of this shift of trauma as the sign of human suffering for Meister and Fassin. In the context of Israel and Palestine, of course, that collective trauma is repeatedly reiterated by the Israeli state as it interpolates its citizens over and over again into the impending threat. Although I absolutely agree with Harish that the question of 50 years ago and today, we can't, it's not that the Holocaust completely recedes, well, anyway, it started in the 60s. But there are other ways of configuring the threat that also rise in dominance over time. Palestinians were and are not simply the new Nazis. They were and are the natives in a colonial regime. That is, they are pulled into the differences of the civilized and the primitive with all the particular forms of racialization that ground settler colonial regimes, and that neither followed nor was dependent on the history of Nazi Germany. Moreover, Ashkenazi Jews were also Europeans, and they viewed the world as such. In other words, I also, and I don't know, Gil and I might get into this over this as well, but I it's very hard for me to fully buy the kind of Euro-Christian versus Jewish dichotomy that's posited in the paper. One question is, at what point does the Euro-Christian become the Euro-Judeo-Christian? In other words, does the Jewish in its dominant or hegemonic form emerge as different in the 20th century? And what does it mean to constantly and only refer to that as Euro-Christian? Okay. Moreover, the perpetrator-victim relationship in Israel and Palestine today is not simply an Ashkenazi-Palestinian dyad, and as you guys discussed, although I came in at the end of the question about the Mizrahim, Mizrahi Jews are not who they were in the 1950s. Their electoral power in the Israeli state is hard to ignore, and in my view, it's too simple to argue that they have been, quote, indoctrinated into the trauma of European Jewry, in contrast to, say, Ashkenazi Jews, who somehow more fully own that. Politically, I respect the desire then to recuperate a Jewish tradition that thinks otherwise, that runs through this paper. Nevertheless, I worry about the fixity through which the work of political critique operates here, one that ultimately grounds itself in an identity claim. Even in this instance, it is a claim to and a claim and call to remember the identity of an ethical tradition, what seems to be marked as the more true, the non-Euro-Christian ethical tradition, rather than simply an assertion of an individual or collective self. Okay, finally. Perhaps instead of such binaries, we might take inspiration from Mohammed's paper and its reading of Kashmiri history writers who are producing an archive of what he calls the fractured present. The fundamental fracturing performed by this counter-history writing is a splintering of the Indian nation-state itself and its forms of nationalist historiography through a rereading of events and through a refusal of fixed identities. That is, Kashmiri identity as a religious syncretistic one rather than as political, and of course, what is clear as historical in its content. And of course, part of that, I think it's interesting, the black hole, not just of post-colonial studies, but in subaltern studies that you point out, of a field that was supposed to be precisely the anti-nationalist historiography. And in writing history, as Mohammed points out, it is not just a counter-narrative, but counter-forms that emerge. For example, one of the organizing logics of this history writing is the chronicle. Let me quote. Shakil Bakhshi maintains an open public diary when he notes daily events in the form of Today in History. His accumulating diary, which he publishes on Facebook, lists events like massacres, martyrdoms, arson by Indian soldiers, public statements, visits of dignitaries, etc., that have occurred on a particular day. This mode of history writing creates a shadow archive of violence. It is an archive of the fractured or dismembered present, which might be discovered later, but of which no official record will have existed, unquote. In ways both divergent and simultaneously acts of déjà vu, each of these papers and the projects to which they are tied are practices of creating a shadow archive of violence. What the meaning of these archives will turn out to have been, to paraphrase Derrida on the temporality of the archive, is yet to be seen. That depends on what possibilities emerge for the acknowledgement of the systems of violence and colonial dispossession that they chart or remember. Nevertheless, each is an act of refusal in its own right, an act of troubling the subtle, I'm quoting him from Mohammed's paper, but he's paraphrasing Judith Butler, the troubling the subtle and the not so subtle ruses of power, unquote. And the ways in which various themes and frameworks echo across the paper is itself testament to the importance, political and analytic, of the comparative project that framed the conference today. Thank you.
This is what Alliance and Solidarity look like. I've been asked by my friend Abed to come here and to thank all of you. So I'm thanking all of you. It was really just wonderful. I have nothing, I wasn't even prepared to be here. Anyway, okay, you'll pay for this. But I want to say that this is it's been an incredibly generative space. And it's been a space for some of us, at least those of us working on Kashmir, a first, to meet and to be open, if you will, about the hesitancies, the things we struggle with, the things that are not named or are dangerous to name, and to find a home in which, for a moment, as refugees, I want to mark that too. I was talking to Khurram Parvez on the phone yesterday, and he said, well, thank them, because how nice. We're refugees in the Center for Palestine Studies, because we don't have a Center for Kashmir Studies, and I thought how wonderful that is. So thank you for this hospitality and a beginning to think together, and you are just amazing, rocking people at the Center for Palestine Studies, people whose work that I value and adore, and it was wonderful to be here amongst all of you. Thank you to Junaid, to Richard, to Sharan, to Abed, and thank you, of course, to Brinkley, to Gil, to Rashid, and to the very wonderful Professor El Haj. Okay. Can I go? Thank you.